Hi, my name's Cody, and I'm a mobile infrastructure engineer. In this video, I'm going to show you how to debug your slow Gradle build. One of the biggest complaints I hear from developers is that the app they're working on takes too long to compile. They click the Run button, then they have to wait a really long time to see the results of the code they've written. This is terrible. Fast feedback loops are so important in software development. In fact, research done by the Nielsen-Norman Group indicates that if a user has to wait more than 10 seconds, they'll get distracted and go do something else. It's the same for developers. Now, I know that 10 seconds might seem like an unreachable goal, especially given how long most Android apps take to compile. So don't feel beholden to it. Just know that any improvement in build speed is a good thing. Okay, how do we get there? Well, first, I'll go over some fundamental concepts that tie everything together, and then we'll get into the implementation details. When I first looked into increasing build speed, I found a lot of great articles, but by the time I was done reading them, I knew that even though I'd followed their list of steps, my build was still slow. Now I was stuck. Where do I go from here? Well, in order to figure out what to do next, we need to go beyond a list of quick fixes and really take time to understand Gradle and how it works. Gradle is a build system. That means it takes a bunch of code and other stuff and turns it into a runnable app. The way it does this is through a series of tasks. A Gradle task is just a unit of work. For example, that could be, take this source code and compile it, or take these images and compress them, or take these Android manifest files and stitch them all together. Gradle tasks can have dependencies. For example, when you build your Android app, you start a task, maybe called assemble debug, that doesn't actually do any work, except start a bunch of other tasks. And those tasks start others, and so on, until you get this big chain reaction going that eventually spits out your app. So usually, the way a build becomes slow is that some task somewhere thinks it needs to be run, and that task has dependencies, which have their own dependencies, and so forth. And you get a big old chain reaction. So when you're investigating a slow build, the thing that's slow about it is probably just a side effect. It's the big chain reaction. But the actual cause of the whole thing will probably be some small change somewhere, or a dependency between tasks that didn't actually need to exist. But wait, if Gradle has to do all this work to compile tons of source files, how can that ever be fast? Wouldn't that always take forever? Well, actually, yes. But the trick here is that for most things in a build, if the input doesn't change, neither will the output. So for every task, Gradle can ask, is the input the same as it was last time? Does the output still exist? If both of these things are true, then Gradle can just skip running the task. That decision, in Gradle parlance, is called a task outcome. For our purposes, the good ones are up to date, from cache, and skipped. The bad one is executed. Sometimes this just shows up as a blank task outcome too. If you see a good outcome printed next to a task, that means Gradle checked the inputs and outputs and found that nothing changed since the last time it built, and it was able to reuse the same results without doing any work. If you see a bad outcome next to a task, that means Gradle actually did some work, and doing work takes time. The whole process of speeding up a build is just making tasks have good outcomes instead of bad ones. You're not going to be able to do this for every task in every situation. If you change code, it does actually have to be recompiled at some point. But in general, the more good task outcomes, the better. So, how do you actually go about investigating which tasks have good outcomes and which tasks have bad outcomes? Well, let's dive into the details and get started. For this, we'll be using the terminal, the Gradle wrapper, the Gradle profiler, and your favorite text editor that can handle lots of text. The first step is figuring out how you can reproduce the slow build you're interested in. Builds are slow for a lot of different reasons, and so you need to find a specific thing to investigate. For me, I found a small open source Android app online and intentionally introduced something that will cause slow builds. So once we're able to reproduce the slowness reliably and in the same way, we need to run the Gradle build from the command line with a few special flags. Firstly, we're going to profile the build using the built-in Gradle profiler. This will create a nice HTML report that we can look at once the build is done, telling us what tasks took the longest. Next, I'm passing the info flag here to change what's called the log level of Gradle. Gradle has a couple different log levels, and the info level will make it output a ton of information, some of which will be really helpful in figuring out why certain Gradle tasks take so long to run. And then finally, I'm going to pipe the output of this command to my text editor. A ton of text gets printed here, and it's much easier to manage in another program like Sublime Text or VS Code. Okay, let's run it. As an aside, Gradle also has this thing called Gradle build scans. They're a souped-up version of the HTML profiler report I'm going to generate. I personally don't like build scans because Gradle requires you to agree to their terms of service in order to use this feature. Moreover, your build information gets sent to a server owned by Gradle. To me, this isn't great from a security perspective. What if you end up logging some really important secret in your build accidentally? Now that secret's been sent to someplace you don't control. Even though I'm sure Gradle does its utmost to secure its data, once some piece of information leaves your system, you can pretty much assume that someone, somewhere on the internet, will eventually find it. So I prefer to profile my builds in a way that doesn't send my build information to a third party. All right, our Gradle task is executed successfully. We've got some output in our text editor, and I'm going to open up the profile report that got generated. You can find that report in the build/reports/profile folder of your project. Let's start with an overview of the information in this report. There's some tabs at the top, and basically the only interesting one for our purposes right now is the Task Execution tab. On this page, we have a list of the tasks and how long they took to run. Now, Gradle is able to execute tasks in parallel, and so you might notice that if you add up the time it takes to run all these tasks, it's longer than it actually took in the real world. That's not a huge issue, just something to be aware of. The thing we're going to do here is just start from the top. What task takes the longest to run and why? Okay, let's start with this task here. Really all we need from our profile report is the task name. So copy that into your clipboard, and let's go over to our text editor where we have our build logs. Okay, whoa, this file is huge. There's a lot going on here, but don't worry, we don't actually need to understand it all. Let's just focus on what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand why our task ran. Remember what I said about task inputs and outputs in the fundamental section? A task will be run if its inputs have changed. And so the question becomes, what inputs have changed? We can find this information out by searching for the task name within our logs here. It's a bit of a slog, but keep an eye out for the phrase, is not up to date. So we found our task in the log, and it's not up to date because of a file called buildconfig.java. Apparently it's changed. I didn't change that file though, so what's going on? Here's the point at which your situation will be totally unique. You've tracked down the source of the chain reaction. Now you need to investigate what's causing it. Use your skills as a developer to figure out what's going on. In my case, well, let's open up the build config and see if we can find anything obvious. Oh, there it is. The build config has a timestamp in it, and that's going to change every time I compile the app. All we have to do is remove that timestamp, and now all of our Gradle tasks will be up to date when we build the app with no new changes. So, that's it. Thanks for following along. Let's recap what we covered here. Gradle is a build system that executes tasks. Tasks depend on each other, and usually a slow build happens when one task needs to be executed, then all of its dependencies, and so on, causing a chain reaction. You can find a slow task and its causes by using the Gradle build profiler and the build logs. Well, I hope this was useful and provides you with some good foundational knowledge to build on. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up.